Hello and welcome to the IdeaCast interview series, episode number 56. In this episode, I will have a returning guest, Dr. Bernardo Kastrup, joining me for a third conversation. And this conversation will be divided into two parts. So I will release this conversation on January 6th, 2023, and 24 hours later I will release the second part of the conversation, and they will be divided into roughly an hour and a half each. And so I would like to acknowledge and offer my gratitude to Dr. Bernardo Kastrup for coming back and having a conversation with me in this humble little channel. I very much appreciate it. We cover a wide range of topics. I would say the thing that stands out to me just moments after finishing up my conversation with him is that we get to see a very human side of Bernardo in this conversation. I have no technical or academic or intellectual prowess, but I can relate with people, and so I enjoyed that aspect of being able to talk to Bernardo the philosopher and Bernardo the person. And so that will hopefully show up for you in the conversation as well. I do appreciate you all, YouTube audience, my subscribers, very much appreciate your showing up and watching the content. I derive no revenue from this channel or from anything I do related to it. So just showing up is something that I just want to express my thanks for. So I will hush up and we'll get underway. Thank you again so much. And I'd like to welcome back Dr. Bernardo Kastrup to the IdeaCast interview series for a third time. And I want to publicly acknowledge my gratitude to Bernardo for coming back and speaking with me. I have a tiny little show and I'm not an intellectual by any stretch of the imagination. So I do offer humble gratitude. Bernardo, welcome. I'm so glad to have you back.
Appreciate to be here, Justin. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, it's mutual. It's absolutely mutual. So it is the new year. We're recording this on January 6, 2023. So as is customary, I'll check in with you and see how your new year is starting, and maybe we'll tease out some of the ambitions for the new year. So for yourself personally, are you getting off to a good start in the new year, hopefully?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
I have great expectations for the year. The first days of the year have been spent on preparing for a board meeting. Essentia Foundation has a board that I report to, and we meet about twice a year, and one in the beginning of the year. So I spent the first days of the year preparing for that carefully,
I should say. And I touch in with the website periodically, and it just the think tank that's building in there is just really impressive. The number of people that you have on board, as authors or contributors or a little higher up in the ranks, just absolutely amazing. And to the audience, I will say, if you are not familiar with the Essentia Foundation, I will have a link not only to the website, but also to the Essentia Foundation YouTube channel. They have just under 7,000 subscribers right now. I'd like to add a little zero behind that 7 and see 70,000 or more. So, if silly influencers out there have millions of subscribers, Essentia Foundation deserves at least.
We have big plans for the YouTube channel this year.
Oh, good.
Big investments we are going to make.
Good. And that was a question I had. Do you want to share anything with the audience right now about what's on board for 2023 with Essentia Foundation?
The focus will be on growth.
Okay.
We started back in stealth mode in the summer of 2020, and we came out publicly in January of 2021, so 2 years ago. So initially, we had to establish ourselves as a name with some kind of recognition, some kind of, even brand image. We've achieved that now. We now get contributions without even need to ask for them. We get high quality stuff. We've been able to keep up a very, very regular publication schedule, good material. So now that we consolidated that, we want to grow. So this year is about growth, particularly about growth of the YouTube channel, professionalization of the YouTube channel, bigger productions. We're getting some high caliber people on board. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I hope I don't disappoint people if at the end of the year we haven't managed to do this, but that's the direction we will be pursuing.
Okay. Well, 2022 was a fruitful year. You had some online courses, a couple of iterations of that, or a couple of different series, sequential series. And so I would say if you can at least match what you did last year, then it should be more than satisfient for anyone who's been following
hopefully
you.
We'll do more.
Yeah. Well, that's good. That's good. Always raising the bar. And so I would ask, so those who are in the audience watching right now, and they may not be they may be just becoming acquainted with Essentia Foundation, what ways can the public contribute to the growth of Essentia Foundation? Are you all a crowdfunding entity? Do you have means that people can support you that are available?
We are not a crowdfunded entity. We are currently funded by high net worth individuals.
Okay.
So we do not have a problem with funding for now.
Okay.
Maybe if we grow a lot, we will need to scale up a lot, but that's not the key concern right now. Actually, to accept general donations from multiple parties involves a lot more administration, many more regulations come to be applicable in the Netherlands. So that's a step we are reserving for a moment when we actually need it, when the scale has grown so much that we actually need it. For now, funding is okay. What people can do to help us, and that's much more important than funding, at least at this stage, is to help spread the word, is to retweet, repost, share, talk about us, repost our articles on social media, and help promote what we are doing, help it go viral. Okay. If people can do that, that's the greatest help they can give us at this point.
All right, wonderful. So as I'll echo what I said a moment ago, if you can, by way of distribution, show some love and support, as they say, to the Essentia Foundation, that would be wonderful, because I was following your work prior to the Essentia Foundation, and there were, things were being teased out slowly, and I was really excited for the reveal and the genesis of that would you call it an organization, I guess, or what do you like to call it? It's an organization.
It's a foundation, but a foundation is an organization. Yeah.
Okay, all right. So to the YouTube audience, thank you. In any way that you can generate a contribution. If you have a YouTube channel with some presence, if you have 10,000 subscribers, maybe do a little short. I mean, they have shorts now. I'm too dumb to figure out how to do shorts, but you guys can do it. You're young. Anybody under 40 can do it. So anyway, so I guess let me check in with you because you had teased a couple of times in other conversations prior, at the third quarter of this year, I think, that you were talking about authoring some books in perhaps the next year or the following year, this being 2023 and perhaps into 2024. Would you like to share some thoughts on that? And then we'll get into some good Bernardo Kastrup conversation.
Yeah, the last time I wrote a book, I finished almost 3 years ago, February of 2020. That's when I finished Science Ideated, which was a collection of essays. So I've been now 3 years going without writing books. I've written essays, but most of my time, the past 3 years, have been dedicated to the work of others through Essentia Foundation, establishing Essentia Foundation. When you start from scratch, it's a lot of work to come from nothing to a little thing. To be a little thing requires a whole lot of work, more than to go from a little thing to a big thing. So those 3 years, I neglected my own ideas, my own impetus to write almost completely. The essays I wrote out of my own initiative had to do with geopolitics, because 2022 has, to use a crass expression, has grabbed me by the balls in terms of the emotional engagement I was having and still do with what was going on in Europe. So that's what I wrote out of my own initiative. And technical writing, philosophy writing, I only wrote what I was commissioned to do. So 3 years of neglect that my daimon has tolerated and accepted. But around summer last year, it started becoming clear to me that now I have to give expression to whatever is trying to express itself through me. I cannot neglect that responsibility anymore. So this year I plan to write 2 books. They are already ready in my mind. So it's not, a great effort. It's not like I need to do thorough research, or I've done the research. The books are written in my mind. I just need to type the words. And so it's not a major effort. It's something I can do late in the evening if I work consequently 3-4 times a week. But that's what I would do. I will write 2 books this year.
Okay.
And they will be published only 2025.
Okay.
No, 2024,
Okay.
mid 2024. It takes maybe even 2025. It takes a year from the moment you finish the manuscript until the book's actually available.
Okay. Okay. So for those waiting with bated breath, patience. There'll be lots of good stuff from Essentia Foundation, so we'll channel that energy into Essentia Foundation.
That's it.
So the last person-to-person question I will ask you, the friendly, familiar question is, how's Floki doing? He has a fan base. I've seen tribute videos to Floki where they do, these compilations and mosaics of his appearances. I just have that.
He's usually here. Right now he's not, but he's probably eating. But
Okay.
he'll show up at some point, I'm sure.
He'll make a visit.
He's doing okay. He will have an Instagram account soon.
He should.
My partner is preparing an Instagram account for him.
Awesome.
Based on popular demand.
Yeah. I was going to say, because things pop up on your Facebook page or Twitter or whatever, and they're just little tributes to Floki. So I thought I'd ask, because I know there's probably people coming here to watch. And I follow cats on Twitter. There's a cat with 2 noses. It's Memphis or something. Yeah, Memphis the 2-nosed cat, and there's Pebbles the blind cat. I love wabi-sabi cats that are defective. So I follow tripod cat. Anyway, it's a weird thing of mine.
You will have one more to follow soon.
Yeah, good. I will definitely. And I have my co-pilot cat here. That's Spot the cat for obvious reasons. So
he looks a bit like Floki.
yeah, it's very similar. She's a Manx, so she has no tail. And she has, and we kept her name Spot because she came from a no-kill shelter, and she was constant recidivism. She would go out, get adopted, and brought back, and adopted and brought back. And she has chronic sinuses, so she's constantly, making these weird sounds. And I think that, anyway, but she's got her forever home here with us now. So, all right,
fantastic.
So we got kitty talk out of the way. Hopefully we didn't drive the audience away too far. We're coming back now, I promise. All right, so touching base with Essentia Foundation's content production, I would want to perhaps begin our conversation with an outstanding, I guess it was a trialogue, or it was a dialogue with a good host. And it relates to your conversation with Marcus Mueller. And it was an acknowledgement of the 2022 Nobel Prize in Physics shared by 3 gentlemen. And I guess the work was done relating to quantum teleportation and perhaps in the crypto quantum utilitarian aspect of quantum use for value for everyday use. But it brought up some interesting things, and I'm not going to do it any justice. You'll do a much better job, but this is a little bit of the setup. But so to the point of the conversation that you had with Marcus Mueller, and fittingly, I reached out to you prior to this release of this video, and I wanted to, and so my pitch to you to come back was to talk about relationality. And so for those in the audience, we're going to spend a little time on relationality. And of course, it's a huge word. It means a lot of things, but I thought we'd start with that conversation with you and Marcus Mueller and work our way up almost in sort of an emergent fashion with maybe some supervenience coming in from the other side. But let's start with that conversation. And can you give us maybe a thumbnail sketch of what the Nobel Prize entailed, and also what the great work that Marcus Mueller is doing, because he's also, I believe, involved in work with quantum cryptography. I want to say that without tripping over it. So I'll hush. Let's get you to start that, and then I'll ask you some questions.
Okay, so quantum theory makes a prediction about the behavior of so-called entangled particles that is incompatible with the statistics you would get if particles had local standalone existence. In other words, if the particles existed as they are after measurement, also before measurement. If measurement simply would unclose the property or disclose the properties the particles already had just prior to measurement, you would get statistics about the correlation of the 2 entangled particles that are different from the predictions of quantum mechanics. So what is right? Is it local realism, the notion that the particles exist locally before they are measured? Or is it quantum mechanics? One of the two is not correct. And a physicist has proposed an experiment in the late 60s, a so-called Bell test, as a way to empirically establish which of the two is correct. I'm oversimplifying this a bit. It's not only about local realism. There is more to this. Some physicists would even contest that local realism is really what's at stake here. There are the so-called no-go theorems that are a little bit more nuanced than what I'm explaining, but I can't do better than this in a quick podcast. And then it took until the late 70s and early 80s until the technology evolved to perform Bell's experiments and test if quantum theory is correct, which would eliminate our metaphysical assumptions about the nature of reality, namely that physical entities have standalone existence. And the initial tests were done, you could, who was it that did it? Was it Anton Zeilinger? Was it, how can I forget his name? The French winner. Might take a medicine that screws up my memory for names, but never mind. The three winners were involved in the early tests of this thing. There were more sophisticated tests done in the 21st century. There were more so-called inequalities proposed than Bell's inequalities. Tony Leggett, another physicist, proposed more inequalities in 2003, which were again tested. And all of these tests have confirmed that quantum theory is right. And therefore, we have to abandon this idea that reality is made of physical entities with standalone existence that causally affect one another at less than the speed of light, which is the metaphysical prejudice we all have as a culture. It's how we tend to see the world. But it turns out that that cannot be right unless you adopt some woo-woo theoretical fantasies for which we have absolutely no empirical evidence and not even a coherent, solid theoretical formulation, like superdeterminism or multiverses, Wigner's interpretation and all that. So unless you want, unless you're prepared to go down that la-la land, you have to acknowledge that reality is not made of physical entities with standalone existence. Instead, physicality is relational. It's relative. It's like movement. There is no absolute movement. Movement is a relationship between two entities at least. And it turns out that the whole of realities, the whole of physical reality is like movement. It's not absolute. It doesn't have standalone existence. It's a relational thing that arises from measurement, physical reality, which then raises the question, what is it that you measure? Because if physicality is what arises from measurement, and all experiments are saying this and have been saying this for 40 years, and they now have the Nobel Prize to go with them, then what is it that is measured? Well, it's something non-physical. And what is it? What does it mean to say that something is non-physical rigorously? Well, it means to say that it's something that cannot be described through physical quantities alone, like mass, charge, momentum, amplitude, frequency, and so on and so forth. Is there something we know that cannot be described exhaustively by physical quantities? Well, of course. That's mental states. What is the length in centimeters of your thought? What is the weight in grams of your emotions? The endogenous experiential states are not describable through physical quantities. So under that definition, they are examples of things that exist, are even absolute, but they're not physical because they're not describable through physical quantities. So the suggestion I put forward, and physicists don't go that far, and they shouldn't go that far. Marcus does not go this far and should not go this far. But the suggestion that I, as a philosopher, put forward is that, well, reality as it actually is out there is made of mental states. And physicality is what arises when we measure those mental states through the interface of this dashboard of dials that is the screen of perception. So physicality is a perceptual representation of reality as it actually is. Reality as it actually is, it's not physical. Physicality arises only when we measure and represent reality. And I would say that dovetails very nicely with physical experiments, with the experiments that now, after 40 years plus, have gotten the Nobel Prize.
Okay. And I listened to that conversation with you and Marcus Mueller a couple times. And so it seemed like Marcus was saying that when measurements are made, that it's perfectly acceptable, for two observers, measurers, be they instruments or persons, to get different results. And this shouldn't shake things up too much. And am I misrepresenting that when I say that? So again, it's a sort of a relativistic, like you said, in motion kind of perspective of the measurements being taken. And it could be the Bob and Alice thing that's kind of a classic, quantum heuristic, where you can have two different measurements in two different locations and there is not non-locality maybe arising or presenting itself there. What was he saying when he was talking about almost like, oh, I can't remember the language he used, but anyway, he inferred something there, I think.
Well, Marcus has his own ideas, which he publishes. There is a fantastic paper by him available on the archive for anybody to look at. The paper that is constantly updating. I forgot the title. I think it's something like Law Without Law. How does the regularity of the physical world emerge if the world is not absolutely physical? So I recommend everybody to go have a look at that, and you see what Marcus's views are. In the context of my last conversation with him, which was recorded and published on the website of Essentia Foundation, he was speaking as the host of a conference we had just held on the physics of first-person perspective, this notion that physicality is what arises, is what you see next once you make a measurement. And we have to refrain from making this metaphysical assumption that that physicality is absolute and precedes measurement, because all we have is measurement. All we have is what we will see next. So I don't know in the context of that conversation what exactly you were alluding to, but the person, the physicist, that is most clearly on record saying that all physical entities are relational is Carlo Rovelli. Marcus' views are not identical to Rovelli's. Marcus and the conference, and all the other people in the conference, they are in the business of making no-go theorems. In other words, they are not telling you what reality is. They are just trying to find out through mathematics and experiment what combinations of assumptions about reality you are not allowed to make because they are wrong, because they are mutually contradictory.
Right.
So it's a very neutral business. It's not philosophy.
Yeah.
It carries more certainty with it because it is based on theory, mathematics, and experimentation. They are not in the business of speculating. I am in that business. They are in the business of putting boundaries on our speculations such that we don't fall off a cliff. They put the guardrails there, and they inform us of what combinations of assumptions are actually mutually contradictory. And we should abandon them. We should not insist on them, even if they are very intuitive, because we know now enough to know that they contradict one another. And then whatever remains on the table, then it's the business of philosophers to go pick on those and construct a narrative that is guided by reason and evidence, but which is not 100% certain. Okay.
And for the audience, I will try to find what Marcus had said, and I'll timestamp it, set it down as a link, and you guys can work with it and understand it, because it's just, I've been cramming for my interview with Bernardo. It's 10,000 things shoved in my head in the last 2 or 3 days. So I do apologize for having that aphasia there. But yeah, like I said, I'll reconcile that with having that down below. But I think the point is, and again, it's as you said, science is science. That has to be bracketed. It is what you do. And that's one of my huge pet peeves with these, and you call them the spokespeople, the celebrity of science and all this silly nonsense, the DeGrasse Tysons of the world or whatever, Brian Greens of the world. And I hear some of these, is it Cox? Well, there's
Brian Greene. Brian Greene, I respect a little more.
Well, no, and I'm not picking on them per se. So I'm just throwing names out, celebrities of science. And we could say Sean Carroll or, anybody. But anyways, some of these folks who are lower on the food chain in terms of relevance will say that we don't need philosophy. We don't need metaphysics anymore. We have science. And I've even heard people say, we have sociology. We don't need psychology anymore. All these crazy statements being made. And I've said this before in other interviews. It's like, render unto science that which is science. And on either end of that bracketing of science, you have to have metaphysics. Otherwise, you can't ask questions and you can't go over the research that you just did. And so I think and I'm an idiot. And this is the most obvious thing to anyone, I think, that you have to bookend these kind of things. So anyway, I'm sort of being very dramatic and agreeing with you that we have to be very cautious and conservative about how we discuss things. And so that's my tuppence there. That's my little.
If I can comment briefly on that, Justin. Well, let's start with a fact, and then I can sort of try to couch that fact in things that can render the fact understandable. But the fact is, people who claim that science has replaced philosophy or even can replace philosophy, they do not understand what science and philosophy are. Okay. And unfortunately, there are many people with a PhD behind their names who don't really understand what science and philosophy are. And this is just a fact. There is no, it's not polemical. Right. Science asks questions of the kind, how does nature behave? What will nature do? It's all about behavior, because that's what experiments can tell us. Mm-hmm. And a part of philosophy called metaphysics, or even more specifically ontology, asks questions of being. Mm-hmm. What is the thing that behaves? And that is a question that the methods of science cannot answer. So you need the methods of philosophy. So metaphysics and science, they are complementary. They cannot replace one another. And it's very hard to do one without the other, because they inform one another. So this is a fact. Now, why do so many people feel tempted to say, well, we don't need philosophy anymore? And the reason for that is that science has a reason from within philosophy. What we call science today was once called natural philosophy. And that's the history of science. It began as natural speculation. And once empiricism came in, and we could tie that up with theoretical reasoning, but always starting from facts and then theory following the facts and not the other way around, as it happened, for instance, in the philosophy of scholasticism in the Middle Ages, where theoretical speculation was first and the facts should follow from that. Well, that's not how it works. Mm-hmm. So science arose from a sort of a development of natural philosophy. And now you could say science replaces natural philosophy. That is correct. Mm-hmm. That is correct, because natural philosophy asks questions about how nature behaves. And we can say that, okay, natural philosophy has evolved into science. It's not as much that science got rid of natural philosophy. Science is what natural philosophy became. And it's more productive to speak of it as science today than as natural philosophy, because otherwise we would be speaking about the past, about things that no longer are, because they have become science. Mm-hmm. But the error is when people take that and they think that the whole of philosophy was natural philosophy, and therefore we don't need philosophy anymore. No. Natural philosophy was one aspect of philosophy. There are many others, such as metaphysics, such as ethics, mm-hmm. and these other aspects of philosophy are very alive and well, thank you. And people who do not know this, or who think it's not true, they're just naive and ignorant. Mm-hmm. And many of them have big mouths, unfortunately.
Yeah, and they fill halls and sell books, and that's the thing that scares me. Yeah, I even see tweets on Twitter, and I'm like, oh my god. And again, I'm not a, I'm the furthest thing from an intellectual person, but it's like, so anyway. But I won't get back on my soapbox just yet. So let's move. And you mentioned ontology. Let's move away from the calculations and the science that's being done, and move relationality up to the macro, what we would maybe have called the relativistic world, the Einsteinian world, or however you want to frame that, the world we interact with. And can we bring relationality up to that using your monist idealism? I want to acknowledge that, take it for granted in this conversation, so I'm not trying to invoke any kind of dualities, but what can we understand and I want to bring in your dashboard of dials, or the headset that Hoffman talks about. And one of the, I guess the most burning question I have with this kind of relationality, and this is something you've talked to about quite a bit, it's a big chunk of what you work with, and that's sort of the qualia of experience. And so one question I wanted to pose to you, maybe to kick off this more macro scale relationality, is when it comes to qualia, and we operate through the dashboard of dials as it relates to our sense organs. And if you want to, refresh that for people who maybe just be coming to you for the first time or this conversation, we can do that. And so I can throw out an analogy to the dashboard that I like too, is information. People like to say that the sense organs take in 10 million bits of information per second, but yet on the screen of perception, we only register 40 to 120 of those bits. So maybe that's a nice complementary way of talking about the dashboard. Qualia, as we understand it, the bitterness of defeat, as you like to say, the sweetness of a strawberry, the qualities, the felt experience of life. On the dashboard of perception, does qualia transcend the dashboard to that which is the thing in itself, or the subjective layer of the field of subjectivity, as you like to say? So I'll start with that.
Okay, so the dashboard metaphor is the notion that the physical world is what appears on the screen of perception, but the screen of perception is akin to a dashboard, not to a transparent window into the world. In other words, we have extremely good reasons today, theoretical and otherwise, to discard the notion, the naive realist notion that what we see on the screen of perception is the world as it actually is. It's not. The screen of perception is like a dashboard, like the dashboard of an airplane. It conveys accurate and important information about the world, but it isn't the world. In an airplane, the dashboard is not the sky outside. It conveys information about the sky outside, which you have to take seriously, otherwise you will crash your plane. But the dashboard isn't the sky outside. Now, for exactly the same reason, the physical world isn't the actual world. What we call the physical world is a representation on the dashboard that is our screen of perception. It conveys important information about the world, so important that if we don't take perception seriously, we will die, we will fall off a cliff, or not run away from the tiger, or not find food or water. So we have to take the dashboard seriously, just like pilots flying by instruments take their dashboard seriously to fly safely and land safely. But we cannot make the mistake of saying our dashboard is the world, which is the mistake we make when we say the physical world is the world as it is. No, it's a representation thereof. So that's the metaphor. Now, do qualia transcend the dashboard? The dashboard is itself qualitative. The screen of perception is a dance of qualia. It's a dance of colors, of flavors, of smells, of melodies. The dashboard is made of qualities. Our inner states, even those that are not perceptual, like the bitterness of disappointment or the elation of falling in love, these are also qualitative states, which is what qualia means, qualitative states, as opposed to quantitative states like mass, charge, momentum, frequency, amplitude, and so forth. I think everything is qualitative. The dashboard is qualitative. Our inner states, endogenous states, are qualitative. And the world beyond the dashboard is qualitative too. But the qualities of the world as it is in itself are different from the qualities of the dashboard. One tracks the other. One represents the other. Both are qualitative, but they are not made of the same qualities.
When it comes to the dashboard, and let me limit it to a cognitive evolution, if you will. And we had talked about that before I hit record, that humans have gone from being instinctual creatures to these creatures like you and I that are having a conversation. We're drawing in the past and predicting futures and so forth. Do you see room for further cognitive, I almost don't like the word evolution, but the expansion perhaps, so that the dashboard, and again, using a poor choice of words perhaps, but is more revealing of what, and I know you talk about the entropy states that, you know, we could cook ourselves literally by bringing too much in. Do you see wiggle room there, or is it a fixed dashboard? In other words, 200,000 years ago, was the were there less dials, and were they more steampunk than the, you know, modern dashboard of an airplane, which is all computer screens and so forth? Sorry, I'm chopping up your metaphor, but
No,
you see where I'm going.
for the 4 billion years of the existence of life on this rock, it has never been fixed. It has always changed, as best as we can tell, based on fossil record, evolutionary theory, and so on. And even by looking at the variety of life that exists today, the dashboards are not identical. Bees don't see the world as we do.
Mm-hmm.
We have every reason to think that. So no, it's not fixed, but I don't think it is evolving in the direction that you suggested.
Mm-hmm.
You used the term more revealing. Yes, it will be more revealing, but probably not in the sense that you meant. I think what you mean is it going in the direction of telling us more what the world is in and of itself, as it, telling us more about the world as it actually is?
Mm-hmm.
And I would say, no. If anything, it goes in a different direction, because the evolution of the dashboard is driven by fitness, not by truth in the sense of showing us the world as it actually is. It's precisely the contrary. It would be deadly for us to see the world as it actually is. There would be no upper bound to our inner entropy if our inner perceptual states would mirror the states of the world, and there is no upper bound for the entropy of the states of the world. It would be deadly to look at the world if our dashboard showed us the world as it actually is.
Okay.
It would be deadly in evolutionary terms as well, because evolution is about fitness. It's about survival. It's not about seeing things as they actually are. So that's what drives this change. So I think the change will continue, but it will not go in the direction of showing us the world as it actually is, because it's not driven by that at all. The wish to see the world as it actually is a conceptual, intellectual wish. But from a biological perspective, it's a very deadly wish if it were to be granted.
Okay, so I'll come back with two things. Then let's take the ontological component out of my question, which it was probably baked in there when I asked it, but not the revelatory in this, you know, sort of mystical sense. But when we talk about a evolutionary revelation, I would say it's safe to say that we, again, acknowledging that we are metaconscious and introspective creatures, we've afforded ourselves a different kind of evolution. So it is again, a mental evolution or a cognitive evolution. And so maybe that does nothing to change the dashboard per se, but so maybe we could do dashboard 2.0 and say, you know, so is there any space left within the constraints of naturalism? And I'm with you, I am nothing supernatural for me. What is left in terms of our, again, not the ontological understanding, but more like you could grant that certain creatures see in ultraviolet, you can grant infrared, so that's a trivial kind of expansion, but you know, basically there's a limit to this, right? As you said, we could just boil up into entropic soup. So I'm just wondering if we've maxed out. Maybe that's the best way to ask that question. Again, not from an ontological perspective, but from a sort of psycho-emotional, perceptive kind of position, intellectual position, or however you want to frame that. I'm not sure what the right word might be.
I think we can make a lot of progress. One avenue, which is the avenue I adopt because that's where my disposition lies, is reason. A consequent, unprejudiced application of reason can lead us to undisclosed landscapes still. The key word being unprejudiced, because a lot of what passes by reason today is just a prejudiced application of a particular metaphysical view that has historical momentum, namely materialism, which represents a repeated and significant violation of reason. So if we apply reason properly, true reason, metaphysically unbiased reason, I think we can disclose a lot more. We can make great progress. The other avenue, which is not where my dispositions lie, but many people have that disposition, and it's an equally valid avenue, perhaps even more valid. It's introspection. So instead of looking at the world with your eyes open, view the world with your eyes closed. We are dissociative processes in nature. If the bottom layer of nature, the most fundamental layer, is a field of subjectivity, then we are segments of that field of subjectivity that are cognitively dissociated from the rest. But no process in nature is perfect. Rain doesn't dry immediately after it stops raining, and completely. Combustion never burns everything there is to burn, and dissociation never dissociates us completely. Why would it? No process in nature is perfect in that sense. It's naive to think that dissociation, unlike everything else, would be perfect, which allows us at least some degree of access to reality as it is, not via the dashboard, not via perception, but through introspection. And then many people have been there and came back with stories that are pretty consistent with what reason is indicating, a form of objective or analytic idealism. So we have that too. We have reason and we have introspection.
Okay. Keeping in the category of evolution, or what might be seen as a revelation from our perspective, and you've talked about this in other conversations, excuse me, when it comes to our growth and a collective individuation, if I could maybe invoke a Jungian term, and part of a sliver of my motive for asking about the dashboard revealing more is, so you've got people whom I don't put a lot of stock in their thinking in this regard, like Sri Aurobindo talks about a supermind coming down into almost this Ubermensch kind of character that is the new psychic evolution of humanity. I don't put a lot of value in that, but I also see the intuition that's there, that we are moving in a direction. We are, and again, you've talked about this in other conversations, we're moving forward, and you don't think there's really a lure there necessarily, but that this thing in itself, we could call it God or the field of subjectivity, is through us moving hopefully forward, hopefully in a progressive direction. And Schopenhauer says the will is blind. What do you see as a roadmap for this? I mean, we're obviously in a very nihilistic period right now. We're in a very suicidal, species suicidal period right now, and it's messy and it's clumsy, and you talk a lot about suffering and so forth. But conversely, there are people, again, like Aurobindo, who have these very pie in the sky kind of ideas about it, and I'm very cynical. I don't really go that far at all. But anyway, so to get you to a question, what does that evolution psychically look like? Psycho-emotional evolution of the species.
Humanity in general, all humans, even materialists, even the cynics, have a natural religious impulse. And instead of trying to defend this statement philosophically, I'll just appeal to empirical data. And psychologists, clinicians worldwide know this to be true. So it's a fact. And as part of that natural religious impulse, there is a great temptation of trying to bring the divinity down into something concrete that we can relate directly to. You see that even amongst materialists, for instance, in the post-humanist movement, which is a religious movement. It has all the hallmarks of a religious movement.
Right.
You deny the divinity only to try to concretize the divinity in the form of an AI that is so far ahead of humanity's mental capabilities that it becomes a god.
Yeah.
And you see that even amongst metaphysically agnostic people like Nietzsche. You alluded to the Ubermensch of Nietzsche. Nietzsche was a declared metaphysical agnostic. He would poo-poo idealism as much as he poo-pooed materialism. But he too, because of his undeniable religious disposition, he was the son of a pastor, tried to concretize the numinous meaning of the intuition of a divinity in the form of a person. the Ubermensch, the Superman. Christianity does that, concretizes the divinity in the form of a man, Jesus the Christ. So you see that all over, and it's understandable. It's part of the makeup of a human being. We are meaning-seeking individuals, and the divinity is the embodiment of meaning, is the embodiment of the salvation from our suffering, our psychological suffering. So this is normal. Do I think that some version of this is coming, that we will concretize the divinity through our own cognitive evolution? I don't think so. No.
Yeah, I'm with you. I just wanted to ask the question, but yeah. Okay.
Even what might pass for a divinity under analytic idealism, which I personally am comfortable talking about it as divinity, which would be that field of subjectivity that underlies all nature, because it's everywhere, it's immanent in everything. So that sort of fits with the notion of something that is omniscient. Its subjectivity is by definition scient. Now, omniscient is experiences everything. Well, it does that. It's the field of subjectivity that underlies all nature, and it's omnipresent. It's present everywhere because it's immanent in everything. Everything is an expression of it. So you could say, well, that comes close to the notion of a divinity, with which I agree so much that I even am comfortable using the word divinity for it. But then I have to rush and say, what parts of the cultural inheritance of the word divinity then don't apply? And a big one is what doesn't apply to it is meta-consciousness, is our ability to be self-aware, to deliberate, to apply moral judgment. I don't think any of this applies to that subjective field underlying our nature beyond us as some of the expressions of that thing. Beyond us, I don't think this mind at large is capable of conscious metacognition, of deliberation, of passing moral judgment. I think it's instinctual. Yeah. It's spontaneous. It's a natural thing. I mean, ultimately, I'm a reductionist and a naturalist. And the naturalist part of me tells me that, yeah, you can call that divinity, and it is significantly that, but we have to stop short of thinking of the anthropomorphic Christian deity of the New Testament, the summum bonum, the absolute good, the totally self-aware entity high in the sky. It would be more like the instinctive God of the Old Testament, which is not capable of passing good moral judgment. Therefore, what happened to Job, which is reactive, spontaneous. It would be more like that, I think.
Okay. So on the one end of the spectrum, we have heaven on earth. We have the actualization of a divine expression through these primates. And on the other end, if we want to keep Nietzsche on the table, he has the eternal recurrence and the amor fati. And are you going that far in the other direction, do you think, with your thinking? Sorry, that's redundant. But, are you somewhere on that spectrum where it's like, there's no hope, we're just in this loop? And I mean, it's evident. We've been at war for as long as there's been more than 20 of us gathered, and there's another group of 20 over there, and they've got food. I mean, going back hundreds of thousands of years to now, to where we're just in this constant state of, as you say, suffering. And a lot of it's brought on because of metaconsciousness and planning and all these things. And, suffering happens instinctually with what we would call lower animals, but we've taken that to a high art. And I love your conversation with Jonathan Pageau about awakening too soon and not having the moral grounding, or whatever you want to call it, to lead us to nihilism and despair. And we can bring that on board too. And then we'll get back to my question: amor fati and eternal recurrence on one end, and then the sort of pie in the sky kind of heaven on earth escapism on the other end. So where would you find yourself on that spectrum?
Well, let me start by saying I love Nietzsche so much that I've been to the places where he has been. I've been to the rooms where he used to be. I've been to his favorite island where he dreamed of building his dog house, which is how he refers to it in his correspondence. He wanted a little dog house for himself it's more a peninsula than an island in Lake Sils, Sils Maria in Switzerland.
Okay.
but and I also acknowledge Nietzsche is probably the most influential philosopher of all times, topping Plato in influence.
Mm.
But I also will be the first to tell you that what is strictly philosophy in Nietzsche's writings is nonsensical,
Mm-hmm.
including eternal recurrence.
Mm-hmm.
Eternal recurrence, the notion that whatever you do in your life, whatever experience you have in your life, will happen again exactly as it has happened before, and again and again and again ad infinitum. The effort of this exercise is to prevent you from being able to sort of shrug the issues under the carpet, because they are always coming to come back again.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to bite the bullet of life. You either embrace your destiny, amor fati, the love of fate,
Mm-hmm.
or you are doomed. And so you have to bite the bullet of the bitterness of life, of the disappointment of life, of the failures of life, of all the regrets. And Nietzsche went as far as to say, if there is any one thing in your life to which you have said yes, a good experience, a positive experience to which you have said yes, if you say yes to one of them, you have to say yes to all of them, because they are all interconnected. You would not have the things you say yes to unless you had the things you say no to, and that you reject, and that you regret, and that you avoid, or you're anxious about. And to bring this notion to absolute inner honesty, he came up with this notion of the eternal recurrence. And that's an effort, again, to prevent you from sort of shoving the issue under the carpet and not being committal. You have to commit to life either way, because it's going to come back and happen again and again and again. And that notion was elaborated more recently in the 20th century by Milan Kundera in his book, The Unbearable Lightness of Being. And it was brought to life because Kundera offered the opposite of the eternal return, and therefore highlighted the significance of the eternal return by contrasting it with the unbearable lightness of being, which is the notion embodied by one of the characters in the book, Dr. Thomas, that everything only happens once, and therefore it's all pointless. It carries no weight. It's light, like a feather, like a leaf in the wind. All of life is light. Your errors are light. Your regrets are light. Your successes are light. Your pride is light. It's all ephemeral. It's like a mayfly. It's gone before you even notice it has come. And that takes significance away from life, and therefore the significance of the eternal return. Now, finally, the eternal return is nonsensical. The moment Nietzsche tried to argue about it from a scientific perspective, which he did in the Nachlass, in his unpublished writings, which are bigger than what he did publish. And it's unfortunate, because there is a reason he didn't publish some of that stuff, and people forget it and take the Nachlass as seriously as what he did publish. But in the Nachlass, you see that he made an attempt to defend the eternal return scientifically by saying, if the universe is infinite, either in space or in time, infinite in duration, infinite in dimension, then whatever overall state in the universe we have today, given enough time, and there is enough time in infinity, that combination of states is going to come back. It's going to happen again. It's because infinity is larger than our intuition allows us to accommodate.
Right.
So even if it is indescribably long that it would take for everything to come back to the same configuration it is now, in infinity, it's bound to happen, not only once, but infinite times. The problem with this is, of course, that if your actions now, the choices you make now are bound to happen ad infinitum, which gives your choices weight. What is implied by this attempt to turn eternal return into a scientific theory, what's implied by that is that the choices you are not making right now, those too are bound to happen an infinite number of times. Everything that you could possibly choose will be chosen an infinite number of times, not the things you're actually choosing right now. In other words, instead of giving your choices weight, which is what Nietzsche attempted, they rob your choices of any weight at all, because all the choices you don't make will be equally weighty, so to say. And it's surprising that an intellect like Nietzsche didn't make this obvious next step in his line of reasoning. And that's why I say there is a reason he didn't publish this stuff. There is a reason he, in his published work, he stuck with the poetic nature of the eternal return and not a sort of a rational elaboration, a pseudoscientific elaboration of that, because it would have backfired spectacularly to his face. Now, I know I'm not answering your question yet.
Well,
so how do I see all of this?
Well, let me inject one thing. Can we hold a more eternal recurrence intention as a not quite a paradox, but this dichotomy, and take it away from, again, that going down that path of turning into babble and pseudoscience? Can we refine that invocation of eternal recurrence as almost like karma, where karma gives you an off ramp? Like eventually you learn your shit and you get to go whatever, be one again. So let's lighten up eternal recurrence just a little bit, if that helps you with producing an answer relative to the and it may not be a good dichotomy here with the heaven on earth stuff, that we were talking about earlier.
I think we can, but I think it will lead us. I think the driver that is required to embrace our destiny, let's call it that, like that, is the opposite of what was driving Nietzsche and what drives so many people today. Nietzsche had a fragile ego. And I could go on and elaborate on his biography and his life, and he lost his father at 5, and his women dominated his life while he was young. And his love disappointment with Lou Salome, and his friendship disappointment with Paul Ray. So I could elaborate on all that, but I think scholars, they agree that Nietzsche had a fragile ego. And because being a fragile ego, but also being very rational and honest, and that's Nietzsche's greatest quality, self-honesty. I mean, he blows the scales in self-honesty. He's willing to confront anything about him that he doesn't like, to a fault. Because of that, he quickly concluded that the Christianity of his time, if interpreted literally, and that's all he could do, he had to interpret it literally. He couldn't do more than that. Is obviously false. If interpreted literally, the myth of Christianity is obviously false. It's trivially false, even internally contradictory. So he had to abandon religiosity, even though he had a natural religious disposition. He had one of the greatest religious dispositions on record. And he had to part with that because of his rational self-honesty. So his fragile ego was lost. He had nowhere to hold on to.
Okay.
His life lost all that meaning. So his desperate search for accepting his destiny, accepting his lot, was driven by a natural drive towards ego reinforcement, towards giving meaning to his existence as an individual. In his lifetime, he had, in his sane lifetime, he had no achievements. He was thoroughly ignored by everybody, by the entire world. In his biography, there is a statement that almost makes you cry. He says, I suppose it is just a prejudice to think that I am alive at all. And if I just say this out of context, you laugh, but in the context of the biography, it brings you to tears.
No, I laugh in sympathy. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I've been in places like that in my life before when I was much younger and fragile. And I'm sorry, so I can relate to what he just said.
Yeah, I can. I was never I have never been in that place, but directly, but through him, through his writings, I went there. And it's not a good place to be.
Mm-hmm.
So he wanted to get out of it. And his embrace of destiny was the only thing his self-honesty allowed him to try. So to finally answer your question, is there a way to acknowledge our destiny, to embrace our destiny? Yes, but that's not through ego reinforcement.
Mm-hmm.
It's precisely the opposite. It's through the understanding that your life is not about you,
Mm-hmm.
that existence is not about you as an ego, as an seemingly independent agent. It's the understanding that you are at best the flower in the tree. And what's happening is not about the flower. The flower is a means to an end. The flower dies to make space for the fruit, which dies to make space for the next tree. It's this acknowledgement. I mean, it cannot be only conceptual. It has to percolate your entire being. It has to be a lived reality. If you live this reality, that none of this shit is about you.
Yeah.
Even when you lend your face to it, like I'm doing right now, none of it is about Bernardo Kastrup.
Yeah.
If you live this and you stop taking Bernardo Kastrup too seriously, and you stop taking Justin McSweeney too seriously, and everybody stop taking themselves too seriously, that's when you embrace your destiny.
Mm-hmm.
Just like the flower embraces the destiny of the flower as a part of the tree.
Yeah.
And the flower doesn't need to understand the role it's playing. It only needs to know that it needs to do this and that. And that's the most difficult part. It is to listen to the voice of the impersonal within us, as opposed to the desperate voice of the ego that needs some kind of reassurance and valuations and, and pride and give itself reason to exist and validation and all that. If that desperate voice becomes silent, and the voice of the impersonal comes through to you, that is amor fati. That is the love of fate. That's the embracement of your lot, and which you have to do without understanding it, because we're monkeys running around a rock. Who are we to understand what nature is doing?
Yeah.
It's preposterous.
Absolutely.
It's just like it's preposterous to think that the flower needs to understand the role it's playing. Of course it doesn't. And of course we don't. And we will not in the foreseeable future. And yet we allow the impersonal to express itself through us. First, we need to hear the voice of the impersonal, which for most people is downright impossible for some reason. That's a reflection of the illness of our times. But if you do, that's what it is. It's not about validating Friedrich Nietzsche or validating Bernardo Kastrup.
Yeah.
It's not about that at all. It's on the contrary. It's about not taking Friedrich Nietzsche seriously or Bernardo Kastrup seriously.
Yeah.
I mean, hopefully others take me seriously, but not me. I cannot take myself seriously. The moment I do that, I part with amor fati.
The moment you do that, you become one of these internet quantities, celebrities, spokespeople of X, who go out and they have a degree in biology, but suddenly they're a, social justice warrior, or they're, an activist of some. So I'm sorry, I just tangent, but
No,
that's
right.
that's
And
the
it's not
path that
only
the
that.
ego leads you down.
You get all that if you take yourself seriously, but you get more than that. You get suffering,
Yeah.
you get regret,
Yeah.
you get anxiety,
Yeah.
you get meaninglessness, depression. All of that comes with taking yourself too seriously. Because if you take yourself too seriously and you make your life about you, now you carry responsibility for the outcome of your life, which is an impossible responsibility to shoulder. There are just too many variables, too many forces out of your control. If you decide that you will take responsibility for your destiny, for whether your life turns out good or bad to you as a little ego, whether you'll be happy or not, you're screwed.
Yeah.
Majorly screwed. And one way to get rid of that is to not take yourself seriously and realize that meaning does not reside on you. But just that you have to put your face to meaning. Just in my dream, because I am a normal person, so I fall into the trap of taking myself too seriously every now and then, especially in debates. My dream would be that analytic idealism as an idea would be known by every living creature on this planet and adopted as mainstream. In other words, as famous as possible, analytic idealism. But that Bernardo Kastrup would be unknown. Now, it's impossible to achieve this because otherwise I don't play the role of the flower in the tree. I need to lend my face to it if that's where nature wants to go. But the price I pay is that I'm not immune from suffering, even though I know how to get away from suffering, because I'm always being confronted with situations that bring me back to taking myself too seriously. And that's hell. If I take a holiday for a month and I don't do anything public for a month, I gently land in a place where there is a lot less suffering. So I fight with that. I fight with this thing of, I fight against my objective of spreading the word. When I'm confronted with maybe landing in a platform that will give me exposure to 20 million people, part of me says, yes, you should do that. It contributes to the objective. And another part of me goes like, oh, if Bernardo Kastrup gets famous, I'm screwed. You know what I mean?
Well, and so I invoked a vision of people whose names I won't mention who do things that I won't further mention. I don't see you susceptible of that, honestly, because you've had social relevance for several years now, and I think, and we don't know what the future holds, but I don't think you're going to fall into that like I've seen other people do, and I'll leave it at that. And so. There's a quote that lends itself very nicely to what we're talking about, and that is Beguine mystic Marguerite Porete says, let God annihilate you and consume your soul, and essentially, you'll be where you should be. And I just love that phrase or that quote, because it speaks to what you were sort of speaks to what you were saying. Whereas, you have to dissolve that sense of self-importance and fall into the lure of what the ego can get from something, the exchange, the projection, the archetypal roles that you can fall into, like the Christ father type stuff, and so many people fall into that. And who knows if, like you said, you did suddenly have 7-figure relevance. Again, I don't suspect that you would fall for that, but again, there's case studies of that happening a lot.
Well, if I understand what you're saying, I agree with you. I think I've matured enough to the point that I will never think of myself as, a great deliverer or some kind of messiah. No, I'm immune to that by now. I'm matured enough. But there are many subtle ways that are equally bad, but very subtle, of taking oneself too seriously. I'll tell you one example, because that's the one that I fall for all the time. It's the trap I'm always falling for. You also take yourself too seriously when somebody is talking to you and says bullshit, and you look at that person almost irate and you say, you're full of shit. You're also taking yourself too seriously when you do that. And I am very prone to that. I'm dreading a debate. I mean, we are speaking on a Friday, on the 6th of January. On the 9th of January, I have a much promoted debate with Donald Hoffman and Susan Schneider. And I'm dreading that conversation with Susan, because her career is centered around the notion that silicon computers will become conscious. And that's the kind of thing that brings out that voice in my head, like, why am I even talking to this person? And that's a way of taking yourself too seriously. But it's subtle.
No, and I 100% agree with you, but nonetheless, you are taking up intellectual arms. This is the raison d'etre, and I'm going to butcher that in French, but this is the reason for Essentia Foundation. This is your you and your daimon are trudging through the mud of dogma and misconception, and so I know what you're saying, that the pride involved, that pride comes along for the ride on that, I guess, and me too. I mean, I try to be the ultra agnostic. Like I try not to apprehend anything, right? I try to be between apophasis and agnosticism and agnonoskepticism. I pride myself, but I still get my little feelings hurt and all this and that. So I know what you're saying. But nonetheless, it is your charge, right? Am I wrong? I mean,
you can do that in a level-headed way without the emotion. That emotion of being irritated over somebody else's position.
You're a human, though, man.
Grant
yourself.
Well, humans take themselves too seriously.
I know.
So if the question, because the question you asked is, can we evolve as humans in order to embrace our lot? Yes, but that involves parting with this currently very human characteristic of taking ourselves too seriously.
Yes.
So if that applies to the people that are listening to me now, it applies to me too.
Yeah.
And you see, you have to have some degree of self-awareness in order to talk constructively. And I don't have much of it, but what I have allows me to see that when I get irritated with people defending opinions that I think are ludicrous, that's an instance of my taking myself too seriously. And that's not good. And I'm not pissed off at myself because I have that. I know I'm not perfect. And I would take myself even more seriously if I got pissed off at myself for this. Which I don't. So I can go to bed and say, Bernardo, it's okay, you could have done better, but you are where you are. You're not perfect, and it's fine. You have your weaknesses. Everybody has, and sleep. I can do that. But if we have a level-headed conversation about where we should go as a species if we are to evolve, I think we should go to a place where this Bernardo doesn't exist.
Yeah, and so that ties in. That suits itself nicely to where we started with this. And so I would offer you a thought model that I am not good at, but I try to entertain, and that is that you have to put yourself, the character, the flower that is Bernardo Kastrup or Justin or whomever, on a spectrum. And there's days when you're going to have to be that emotional ascetic that you're kind of speaking to, and I could be misrepresenting. Just reach through and slap me if I said that wrong. And there's other times where you're going to have to be Bernardo, the contentious person that I've seen in your early formative years, 4 or 5 years ago when you were doing some of your early like T-jump interviews. You were very nice to him, but some of these older things that were out there, and you could be feisty and you could be cantankerous, and that's until we do whatever, that we're in this liminal state, right? We became metacognitive and we're moving somewhere, maybe, and not we. So that's the other thing I have to put an asterisk on. It's not we. It is that which is that is using us as flowers. We have to be on a spectrum, I think. There's days when we can be the saintly Bernardo Kastrup, and there's days we can be the cantankerous, feisty Bernardo Kastrup that really has to dig in and defend something doggedly, so that we can be spectral in that sense, that we can dance, maybe, if that's a good word, back and forth.
I think in the early days, there was a point to being like I was, which was to sort of dilute this notion that if you're hard-nosed and you reject bullshit, then only a materialist can do that. And if you're defending some other metaphysics like idealism, then you got to be the flaky, flowery, spiritual, sentimental, nice guy.
Kumbaya.
Kumbaya. Let's all hold hands and sing the Kumbaya. And I think to remove that false association from the collective psyche of our culture was part of the deal. And therefore, my being cantankerous at that time played that role. I could adopt the exact same tone of a Richard Dawkins, of a Brian Cox, and call bullshit, even though I was totally anti-materialist. But what I feel in the impersonal flowing through me is that that phase is over. And to the extent that I still do this today, that's Bernardo Kastrup. That's his habits, that's his dispositions, his personality. It's not the work of the transpersonal. It's my own shit, if you know what I mean. And I'm not advocating for emotional asceticism. I think we should feel love. We should feel, but the feelings that arise solely because we take ourselves too seriously, they will not be there when we don't take ourselves too seriously.
Yeah.
But even if I don't take myself too seriously, I still love my partner. I still love Claudia. I don't need to take myself seriously to have that feeling, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
But if I get pissed off at someone telling me silicon computers will be conscious, that's my own shit, if you know what I mean. That's because I'm taking myself too seriously. Otherwise, I could just have the conversation and put the arguments on the table why I think that's not the case, and not be irritated because someone else thinks nonsense. Because after all, there's a lot of nonsense out there. Why will I be irritated about being confronted with it? I know it's there. You know what I mean?
I'm irritated on your behalf. I mean, when you talk to someone who thinks that silicon, the medium, dictates the emergence of consciousness, that's just, and you'd had a good conversation. We were talking about that young man from Mew, and that came up about the substrate and so forth. And I was recently checking. I've spent weeks trying to figure Keith Frankish out, and you guys have had a couple of things back and forth, and it comes down to a semantic hustle. So this woman that you're going to speak with on the 9th, consciousness, you know, so I bring Keith up. He's a really nice, gentle person, and I'd love to have him on as a guest. But his idea of consciousness, he wrote a retort to your criticism of illusionism, and he thinks consciousness is essentially what you could describe a video camera on an iPhone or a Android, and that phenomenal consciousness is qualia. So I mean, so there's distortions of language, and and yes, it ends up rendering perhaps a pile of bullshit, but that's where I'm seeing some of the, and you know this, I'm not saying it to you and perhaps to the audience, that when you speak on the 9th, that this is what you're confronting, is semantic hustling, semantic ignorance, whatever you want to call it. And God knows that's a shit show to try to sort through that. I guess it makes for good media, it can make content or whatever, but I'm bringing that in as an empathetic response to your having to face this, when it could be done differently, perhaps, but probably not, because there's the dogma and the conviction on the other end that comes in.
I'll try not to feel personally insulted
when that comes up.
Monday,
yeah,
because
yeah.
I think there's a role to be played, with my just putting arguments forward and having a productive engagement without feeling insulted by the mere fact that somebody else holds a position that I think is ludicrously wrong. I can do that in writing. The exchange you're referring to, published by the IAI, was a written exchange.
Mm-hmm.
I forgot his name now, a Princeton neuroscientist who confuses phenomenal consciousness with the conceptual notion of self as an agent.
Mm-hmm.
He mixes up these two completely different conceptual constructs,
right,
and gets lost and makes ridiculous statements to the press, and his inability to defend himself from what I said. And I could keep my cool because I was writing, and when you're writing, you write the first version and it's terrible, and then you wait an afternoon and you come back later that day after you have had a good meal, maybe a glass of wine, and or if you made love with a girlfriend, and then you look at it again and go like, oh no, this is unnecessarily stingy and aggressive, I'll dial it down and stick to the arguments. But when you're alive, it's more difficult.
It's like wrestling. You're in the ring. But hey, Bernardo, that is an element that deserves its own value. It deserves its own space. And so this is the challenge that maybe your daimon is presenting to you, is that, yes, you're going to be thrown into the wrestling ring, and you may be wearing one of those ridiculous wrestling costumes to go in this performative thing. Nonetheless, all the while defending, very proper and meaningful things. But it is an arena, and it is a spectator sport of sorts. I mean, I love that stuff too. I even watch Richard Dawkins debating pedophilic Australian bishops or whatever. It's just like pulp. It's like wrestling. And I never watched wrestling as a kid, but this is my version of wrestling, is I'll watch these guys go. And so anyway, I'm not equating you at all with that. I'm just saying that it's a spectator sport. No, well, but not directly. I don't want to associate you with pedophilic bishops and
no, I mean,
no. I just want
engagement.
Yeah. Just being in the public arena, sparring, going at it, yada, yada. I mean, it's something will come from that, because the 10,000, 30, 40, 50,000 people that watch it, hopefully, lights will come on, and trajectories will shift. And that's all you should probably, not to dictate anything to you, of course, but that's probably what you should hold in your heart. As opposed,
I'm not trying to unduly beat myself for no reason here. That's also a form of taking yourself too seriously.
Self-flagellation.
Self-flagellation. You're taking yourself too seriously.
Yeah.
My point was only that whatever the value is of my confrontational personality dispositions, when you feel upset because somebody else is holding a position that you think is self-evidently nonsensical, that's an instance of you taking yourself too seriously. Otherwise, you would not be irritated. You would not be angry. If you really do not take yourself too seriously, that emotion would not arise in that context. So even if there is a role to be played by my taking myself too seriously, even if that's the case, I'm still taking myself too seriously. You see what I mean? Can you understand that? This link between the irritation of confronting someone speaking nonsense with taking yourself too seriously? Can you see that these two things are tightly associated?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And that's why, in my self-centric perspective, I would put it on a spectrum and say, well, I need to put my gloves on now, even though I will not maybe be proud of myself after it's over with, because I will have emotional reactions in real time to someone. I won't have that opportunity to pause and reflect on what I just, the rage post or whatever that you were about to send out or email. I get that totally. And I get how that is a sense of not betrayal, but just a sense of not being in the right place that you should be, perhaps. I respect that and I admire that. But like I said, I think, and again, what I do is I put it on a spectrum, and I know that there are times when I have to be an asshole. And my mother raised me to be the ultimate confrontationalist. I had to work years to deprogram myself, to stop picking fights with people and stop arguing and pissing people off. And I've come to a place where I just say, I don't know shit and I don't know anything. And I have an ego still, but, I just shut my mouth and, I'll say things, I'll put things out, but it's like, I don't take myself seriously. And I'm forever the agnostic. Like, I don't know anything, and I'm happy with that. That's how I get through life. But anyway, I'm digressing into me. You have to do your thing and you have to be yourself. And maybe this is a next step in the discovery and in unfolding of the internal evolution of the psycho-emotional Bernardo. I don't know. I mean, I just think you should be easy on yourself, but nonetheless, do that review, do the introspective criticism. And maybe it'll set you up for beyond January 9th and this person that you have to deal with and the silliness that will ensue. Thank God you got Donald as your wingman. Donald's a slick talker. I love listening to him. He's just he's almost like a news anchor or something. He's very polished when he talks, and he's just very, to the point, even when he's talking about all the mathematical stuff. So anyway,
very, very different personality disposition than I have. He doesn't suffer from this problem I am describing at all. Donald can very easily and naturally be friends with everybody, which is a personality feature that I'm a little jealous about. I am very confrontational by nature. I thrive in that. And Dutch culture is confrontational. Yeah. And that's one thing that people don't know, especially Americans don't know. In the Netherlands, we confront one another. That's how we regulate society. Because in the Netherlands, the boss is not that other type of being that makes all the calls. The boss is one of us who has the responsibility for some coordination. But you don't take over of your cues from what the boss is saying. That's not Dutch culture. Dutch culture is a networking culture. We keep each other in check through criticism. A Dutch person, if you ask to give a presentation and there are 10 Dutch people in the audience would feel terrible, like they contributed nothing to you if they don't criticize you at the end, because that's how they can give value back to you for having given them the presentation. You point out possible errors, mistakes, contradictions, you criticize, you put your finger on the wound. And I thrive in this. I'm a 100% match with the culture around me. But in the US, for instance, it's very different. People take it as a sign of lack of courtesy, this disrespect.
Yeah.
So in addition to my personal dispositions, I have to deal with the cultural differences between my immediate environment, the corporate culture where have been immersed for 25 years. Because, you know, I used to work for ASML, which is one of the most important companies in the world today that most people probably never heard. You can look it up, ASML. And I worked there for 15 years. And I was basically mentored to be critical of me, of everybody else. That's how we kept ourselves in check. That's how we made ASML what it is today. One of the world's most important. Without ASML, no next iPhone, no next computer, no more internet, nothing. All of that, all of those chips are made with ASML machines. And so this is very deeply embedded in me. And therefore, I am there's a professor in the UK who calls me not the angry philosopher, something to that effect.
Yeah.
Which I'm perfectly okay with. Little does he know that I consider that flattery. But there is this perhaps misperception, and there is this little personality trait that gets triggered when Bernardo takes himself too seriously.
Well, I think you have to, there's this kind of cliche, and it shows up on YouTube with these self-help kind of people, and they break their personalities down into a committee at a table. So there's the empathetic self, there is the aggressive, passive-aggressive self, there is the controlling maternal self. You know, so it's somewhat clever for sort of folk psychology and intuitive understanding of how we're constructed. And I like that analogy sometimes because I do it for myself. And it's like, you know, there's the asshole Justin that's confrontational. There's the deeply empathetic Justin that was beaten out as a child to be more of this, you know, from the parent. And then there's other types of Justins. There's a curious Justin, this hunger for knowledge, which is why you and I are talking right now, that wants to know, learn what they can. I'll never know anything, but I want to learn what I can. So anyway, there's this committee of me that exists, almost like your DID analogies, right? There is these separate components of myself, and the integration and the harmony that can be brought in is a benefit. It's a plus, but it's not totally necessary, because when you think about a lot of folks just get lost in persona. A lot of people just go around as the character they portray on TikTok or Instagram. Narcissism prevails, you know, all this kind of stuff. So the fact that you can even acknowledge that there is this part of you that might need tuning and polishing or whatever it is, or to transcend yourself outside of the confines of a strictly confrontational person, or just to learn to manage. Again, that's why I like the spectrum, is that there is the ideal Bernardo, and then there is the Bernardo that needs to be combative sometimes, and you have to float on that spectrum, I guess. And I'm not trying to be your coach here, but I'm just offering an idea, because you did say something you're expressing, and I appreciate that we're having this kind of conversation, because it'll give me insights into how to not always, you know, get stuck in a groove somewhere that I shouldn't be. But I think, you know, just give yourself space, give yourself credit, give yourself some room to be that person. And if you have to chide yourself in retrospect, then you do that and you develop from that, and it builds you up that much more. I mean, the fact that you're dreading this, you know what the potentials are, and so maybe keep the gatekeeper there to you know, in other words, be the slow Bernardo that day, and just think, you know, what would the evolved Bernardo say to this woman who's putting these silly things out? You know, I don't, and again, I'm not trying to dictate anything to you or coach you too much.
Look, I'm not too worried about Bernardo Kastrup. I'm more worried about giving proper expression to whatever it is that is trying to come into the world through me. That's my sole concern. But yeah, okay, I'll leave it there.
Okay, so let's pause that, and I'll watch that debate, and I'll see. I'll be thinking of this conversation. So what I'd like to do is reel us back about 20 minutes ago, and conclude something. And then what I'm going to say to the audience is that we're going to do, this is a part one of a two-part interview, and I will upload this conversation January 6th. As soon as I'm done speaking with Bernardo, I will start the process, get it out. And then in 24 hours, we'll do part two. And you guys can take a break in between the two conversations. So Bernardo, let's go back for just a second. So we talked about, again, on a spectrum, we have and maybe eternal recurrence isn't the right thing, but so the circuitous nature of human drama and human suffering and lack of evolution, stagnation in a sense of evolution, and then these pie in the sky ideas, like again, I pointed out Sri Aurobindo, and I know he's got some really interesting things. He's also Hegelian, so Hegel inspired, so he's like that dialectic that brings us closer to God kind of thing. And so there's this aspiration. So I would see evolution in the way that you're saying it, that I got from what you were saying earlier, that it's not the human that evolves. It's not us that will transcend into some, again, Ubermensch type, Christ-like entity or whatever we want to call it. It's more that the torch passing forward of reason and civility and empathy and all these things will move generationally, almost like our genetics. It's the mimetic inheritance going forward. It's the stigmergy you talk about. So the shift of the stigmergy moves, and it's not the individual, like the New Age movement says, oh, I'm going to open up my 13-strand crystalline DNA that was given to me by the Palladian Light Council, and we're all going to, again, kumbaya, and, blah, 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 blah. It's not that nonsense. But it's more that the condition of the species, the stigmergic movement shifts a little bit, and it's palpable, and there is less self-produced suffering. Rocks are going to fall on people.
Absolute. It's Hegel's absolute, which evolves through the dialectic of history. I think he hit on something important there.
I like his dialectic, and again, I won't go as far as where he was pointing, but I like, yes. So it's relational, and so that was sort of the quasi theme of our conversation. Is this relationality of advancement, and so can the mind at large, God, through the flowers of the tree, produce the seed, if we want to take that metaphor a next step, that will ultimately allow the species itself, through social and mimetic structures and advancement, or whatever you want to call it, to a more empathetic, more self-aware society that's not doing what we're doing now. I guess if that's a good way to summarize it. Yeah. Do you see that?
Fair.
Okay. So we could finish that maybe by just saying that it is that which is blindly, as Schopenhauer might say, pushing through these non-instinctual creatures, these metacognitive creatures, to an ends.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's accurate, I think.
Okay. YouTube audience, we're going to call this part 1, and I'm going to bring Bernardo back in 24 hours. If you're watching this 3 weeks after it was uploaded, it doesn't matter, but we're going to have a second part. You can look for that in my string of conversations, my idea casts. I want to thank everyone who's stayed to the end of this conversation. We'll be back for the second one. And thank you, Bernardo, for part 1. And all right, so let me do the technical producer stuff, and then we'll get back for part 2.